the next hour, we will have the official launch by Minister of State, Mr. Peter Burke. There will be presentations on the 2 research papers, followed by a response from Eddie Lewis. But firstly, I'd like to hand you over to John O'Connor, who is the Chief Executive of the Housing Agency.
Thank you. Welcome, Minister, panellists, and all of you who have taken the time to join us for this launch and this webinar. The research being launched by the Minister today connects well with the Housing Agency's aims and objectives in promoting the supply of housing to meet the current and future needs and building sustainable communities. Undertaking research and analysis is a key part of the work we do in the Housing Agency, including work in relation to older person housing and the needs of older people. The majority of Irish people aged over 65 live independently. They live in their own homes, in their own communities, and have a good quality of life. With people living longer and our changing demographics, we need to consider what the appropriate policy responses are to addressing these changing needs. An example of a significant demographic change is that by 2031, which is only 10 years away, the number of people aged over 85 in Ireland will double. So just think about that. In 10 years' time, the number of people in Ireland over the age of 85 will be expected to double. You know, that is a very, very significant change. The department set up an implementation group to address the challenges we face with our aging population. We all need to support this implementation group and the critical work it's doing. The overall policy objective is about facilitating and promoting a variety of housing options for older people to remain living in their communities, including providing an appropriate level of supported housing. In my own opinion, we need to ensure that our housing is for everyone. All age groups should be able to live together in integrated communities as far as possible and as far as we can manage that. A good example in terms of a country that focuses on integrating of all age groups is Sweden. So in Sweden, the only capital grant funding provided for housing, from their government is in relation to the provision of older person housing. However, it's only provided where the older person housing is integrated with the rest of housing in a development. So, for example, if it was a development of apartments and you had an apartment block, 1 or 2 floors would be for older person housing, but the rest has to be for housing generally. So I think that's a lesson that we need to consider, and I just suggest to anybody online now just to focus on that. There are a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves in relation to what we do. Are the facilities, services, and infrastructure being funded today what is needed for the future? What is the best use of funding in addressing the needs of our aging population? Is the housing that is being designed and built now going to suit our population as changes over the coming years? I would like to thank Deputy Peter Burke, Minister of State for Local Government and Planning, for taking the time to be here today. Since the summer, the Minister has responsibility for the housing policy for older people. The Housing Agency is supportive of the work you, your department, and the implementation group are doing in the area of housing for older people. I wish you every success in your role. Minister, I'm now going to hand over to you for the official launch of these reports. Thank you.
One second.
Minister, sorry to interrupt you. We just can't hear you right now.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely, we can. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to launch both these papers. And I'm very pleased to be with you here today at the Housing Agency webinar to launch these two publications, which make a valuable contribution into the development for housing for older people and the implementation of the 40 actions in the housing options for our ageing population joint policy launched by the department and in conjunction with the Department of Health in February 2019. They're obviously very changed times in that we deliver these launches and events, which are very challenging for everyone. So I thank everyone for making the effort to try and progress this under difficult circumstances. The joint policy statement arose from specific commitments in Pillar 2 of Rebuilding Ireland on progressing the housing needs of older people through a cross-departmental approach. I know the considerable work has already been carried out by the two departments, and I was delighted earlier on this year to be assigned responsibility in this role and this crucial policy development for our older citizens. We're often hear the call for agencies to use joined up thinking, where solutions are needed in difficult situations, and the policy statement combined with the work of the implementation group is an excellent example of such an approach. And I absolutely commend all the work for those involved in delivering both these papers. In fact, the work started back in 2017, much before my time in the department, with the Department of Housing and Health came together to frame this policy. Population projections in 2016 indicated that the number of people that will be over the age of 65 in Ireland are expected to reach 1.4 million by 2041, or about 23% of the total population, while those over 80 years of age will also quadruple over that same period. Age Friendly Ireland, in its Litter project in 2016, sought the views of over 20,000 older people countrywide on their housing needs, and the Housing for Older People Thinking Ahead report commissioned by the Housing Agency and Ireland Smart Ageing Exchange identified a pressing need for new types of accommodation choices for over 65, as advocated for a need to view the provision of housing for older people in terms of a spectrum of care and it's in other countries. The research also identified the wishes of older people to age in a place not necessarily in their original family home, but in a community of their choosing. There are a number of key principles on which the framework of the 2019 Joint Policy Statement was constructed to take account of what the research was telling us. These are: sustainable housing should be provided in the right location to enable people to age in the community. Housing and the environment should be designed in accordance with the principles of sustaining lifetime housing. Assistive technology should support people to live independently. Adequate consideration should be given for the need for social connectiveness and devising policy, and all stakeholders must be collaboratively work together to achieve all these policy objectives. These principles are rooted in the belief that providing housing options for older people must focus on the development of an environmentally sustainable and supportive life for older people within a well-planned neighbourhood located close to services and amenities. The provision of well-designed quality housing in lifetime communities guided by universal design principles of accessibility, flexibility and sustainability will benefit everyone in the long term. We would not want to live and grow old. Why would someone not want to live and grow old in such a neighbourhood? An implementation monitoring group representative on the relevant stakeholders, including the Older People's Council, was established to oversee the delivery of these 40 actions under the policy statement in September 2019 and is continuing to work in 2020. 4 subgroups were established to examine specific actions from the policy statement, including building planning related aspects for housing with support, health and social care supported housing, and integration and overreaching aspects of housing with supports, and a final subgroup to develop a geographical information system mapping decision tool to ensure that developments specifically for older people are located in the best available and appropriate site to their needs. The implementation group will shortly publish its second report for the period of January to June 2020, detailing the progress in that time, including completion of 2 reports that we are launching today. Against the backdrop of the pandemic, both Ireland and globally, the challenges inherent in the care and accommodation of older people, particularly frail people, who come into sharp focus for policymakers. It is clear that while the current models of residential care for older people have served society well and will continue to do so for those who choose this model, there are other models that can provide an alternative for older people up to and including those with complex needs. And the great news is that these models not only bring about better quality of life and outcomes for the older person, they also can cost less than the traditional model of care. It is therefore fortunate that, particularly in these testing times, we have settled policy in housing options for our older people, underpinned by a body of robust research to inform our actions into future planning for housing and health for our older people. The 2 reports being launched today are a further important contribution to the development of this very important policy. The first of these, Thinking Ahead, the Financial Benefits of Investing in Supported Housing, is published by the Housing Agency, and it complements the 2016 Thinking Ahead report seamlessly by examining the costs and benefits to the state of an expansion in the provision of supported housing for older people. The report analyses a range of supported housing options with varying care requirements as set out in the 2016 report: independent, assisted and specialised, in which the first level is housing with low level of services, the second a medium level, and the third a high level of services. The findings in the report demonstrate that there are considerable financial benefits for the state from investment in such housing. It compares the cost of providing these 3 supported housing options to a number of alternative scenarios which it assumed that supported housing is not available. The report estimates that investing in an additional 11,400 supported housing units over the next 10 years could potentially generate annual benefits of approximately 53 million to the state. The modelling shows that the estimated benefits of each of the 3 models of supported housing apply to both social and privately funded models of supported housing, even when the highest level of care is required in a specialised living model. The type of research is important because while we can all imagine the social benefits of providing supported housing, it tends to be assumed that this will cost more, and it is important to understand that not only are there clear social benefits, but there are also very clear economic rationale for increasing the provision of supported housing in models for our communities. I am confident that this report will contribute in no small way to the development of policy on supported housing, and I can congratulate Rosalind Malloy and her colleagues, Rory Mulholland, on their work. My department, together with the Department of Health, Dublin City Council and Circle Voluntary Housing Agency, is currently piloting a supported housing model in Inchicore, and I know that Rosalind and the Housing Agency are involved with an evaluation of that pilot, and I think this paper, together with the evaluation, will put us in a great position to make the case, provided the model of care for choice for older people as they need support and enable them to remain independent. The Mature Homeless Research Paper is the second publication being launched today and is fulfillment of a commitment in the joint policy document. It was prepared by Owen Corrigan in the department's Home Economics and Local Authority Lending Unit, working with the Department of Finance and Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Services, who undertook a survey of mature homeowners in the summer of 2019. The survey explored the housing circumstances and attitudes of the households composed of homeowners aged 55 plus, with a view to examining the attitude of mature homeowners towards seeking housing better suited to their circumstances by trading down or relocating from areas of high demand to areas of lower demand. The principal findings of the survey show that in the absence of policy interventions, only a low proportion of the group, between 3 and 6% of mature homeowner households, or 19,000 to 35,000 households, would be likely to move forward in the future. And these factors are inhibiting this. For many of them, emotional attachment to their existing home is chief among it. But the paper finds that between 15 and 20% of mature homeowners, or 91,000 to 121,000 households, would be willing to move if the option to sell their home and purchase a smaller, purpose-built home in the same area for a lower price were available. The potential measures most likely to encourage mobility are encourage or provide greater availability of suitable units, simplify the process and have greater state involvement in negotiating it, and or provide financial incentive. The findings of the paper show that the most effective policies for the mature homeowner are likely to be those which assist and guide those homeowners who wish to downsize. As the issue of encouraging both policymakers and individuals to think and plan for the future in a strategic manner is part of our policy framework, this research paper will be valued as a piece of work to take account as we develop policy again in this area. Again, I commend the author, Owen, for his work and all of his colleagues, and I'm delighted to see homegrown research being presented here today. I will finish by referring once again to our current circumstances, which dictate the way we have, unfortunately, to stay apart from one another. We will all find this difficult on an individual level, and we are here today to mark how we can achieve great things through an individual collaborative effort. And this kind of energy we need to harness as a society to deal with the pandemic as a whole. Our older citizens deserve no less from us. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for your words and for the officially launching the two papers. I think one thing which is very clear from what you've said is the benefit of the joined up approach being taken now by the departments and the agencies in the area of housing for older people. And I think also the belief that as well as providing housing options for older people, the focus must also be on developing sustainable and supported housing in well-planned neighbourhoods. So next we're going to hear a presentation from Owen Corrigan. Owen, as you've heard, is an economist with the Economic and Evaluation Unit in the Department of Housing, and he's the lead author of this paper on the attitudes of mature homeowners in Ireland. After Owen, we're going to go straight through to a presentation that's been pre-recorded by myself and Rory Mulholland on the paper on the financial benefits of investing in supported housing.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm here to present a piece of research I did with colleagues in the Department of Finance, Dr. Jerry McGuinness and Owen Joyce. This is a piece of research done in collaboration with the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, and we're publishing this paper today. We'll send a link around so people can access the paper. So this is an attitudinal survey exploring the housing circumstances and attitudes of householders who we described as mature, so aged 55 or older, with a view to generating policy findings. And what we wanted to focus on was the attitudes of those homeowners towards downsizing. It's a face-to-face survey of homeowners over the age of 55. With or without mortgage debt, and this survey was conducted back in May 2019 to September 2019, so obviously before the public health emergency. Non-homeowners are excluded, so local authority renters, private market renters are not in there. And it's a cluster sample, over 1,200 respondents and nationally representative. Useful to note that this cohort of households, 55 plus homeowners, that back in 2016, that was 560,000 households. It's in all likelihood grown considerably since then, and will continue to if the demographics map out as expected. So this is, economically and socially, a significant cohort and of growing significance indeed. So to give you a picture of our respondents, here's the age distribution. A quarter of them were between 55 and 61. A quarter were age 76 or older, and the median age was 69. In terms of their other characteristics, it was almost a 50-50 male-female divide. 60% of our respondents were married, and useful to note, I think, that our breakdown there of marital status, that mapped very well to the census 2016 data we have. So we're pretty sure our sample was robust. And in terms of their economic status, almost 70% are retired or have never worked, with another 25% still in the labour market. We asked a lot of questions about their homes. About 50% of our respondents lived in an urban area, and 4/5 had a front and rear garden. Over 60% lived in a detached home, which at first struck us as a little bit high, but then given that 40% or so of homes in the state are detached, and this cohort is probably towards the upper end of the lifetime income distribution, it made sense to us that such a high proportion are in detached homes. And almost 90% of respondents described the condition of their home as good or very good. As you might expect, very few were living in an apartment. We asked respondents how long they'd lived in the home they're currently living in, and the median response was 35 years, which more than 75% were in their homes for 22 years or longer, which perhaps gives a hint, explains some of our findings later on. We asked respondents how many bedrooms they have in their home, and then how many bedrooms are in regular use. So the teal distribution there in the graph, that shows how many bedrooms there are in the room. The median was 3. And then the overlaid red distribution there is how many bedrooms are in regular use. So you can see the shift there downward, which suggests, which shows really that there are a large number of houses which are arguably underoccupied. I think there's a breakdown of the proportion of unused bedrooms not in regular use. For instance, the number of bedrooms not in regular, or the number of respondents having 2 unused bedrooms the proportion was about 36%. And then mapping that out to society in general, based on our estimates, that's somewhere between 200,000 and 235,000 homes out there, which is not inconsiderable. We also asked respondents to give us a valuation of their home. Now, one might think that, given so many of these households have been in place for so long, high duration of living in the same unit, that perhaps, not having transacted, they might not have a very good, sense of what the home is worth. We have to remember that these homeowners will be, providing a local property tax valuation quite regularly, and I think in the main people would have some sense of what their home is owned. In any event, the median response was somewhere between 200 and 300,000, but there was quite a lot of variance there, as you can see in the graph. We were obviously interested in mobility. We asked, as things stand, what was the likelihood of a respondent moving at some stage in the future? And only 4% said they were either extremely likely or very likely to move. So that's less than 30,000 households of the 559,000. We asked what the reason was, the primary reason why they were unlikely to move. And over 50% said it was an emotional attachment to the home. I think this is an interesting finding, because a lot of the literature and conversations about this topic focus on the community network and ties people have, and friendship and so on. And whilst that was there, we see 15% of people stating that's the first reason. Over 50% are saying actually it's something else. It's their relationship to the structure they live in, the home, presumably the memories and so on, that are implicit in that. Economic reasons were were not major. So passing the home to the next generation, transaction costs and financial barriers and so on, they were 10% or so of first reasons. We asked respondents, we gave respondents 5 hypothetical measures, and asked them how likely they would be to move if these hypothetical measures were introduced. Now, I should be clear; these are measures which are either frequently discussed or have occurred elsewhere, but they're apart from the first part, they're by no means policy proposals here in Ireland. And we found that there was a variation in the response to how attractive these options were. So the greater availability of local units designed for mature homeowners, that shifted the proportion of respondents who felt they were likely to move, shifted from that 4% I mentioned earlier up to 11% if there was greater availability of those units. Interesting, there was a relatively strong response also to any potential state administered scheme to simplify the whole process of moving. So, the state acting in a sense as an honest broker to help guide and assist potential downsizers. About 9% of respondents said a financial incentive or subsidy would also strongly encourage them to move. Whilst a financial product offered by the financial institutions such as bridging loans so on, that was less attractive, just 5%. And any kind of government or local authority charge related to excess bedrooms, that was again that minimal impact, just 5%, so they would be likely to downsize under that circumstance. So I suppose what seems to be coming out, our interpretation of this is that measures that would aid decision making and support homeowners were probably likely to be most effective. You might say, okay, well, 10 or 11%, that's not a lot of households. But when we consider the number here, 560,000 of total households in 2016, 11% is still sizable. Our estimates is somewhere between 60 and 78,000 households would be favorably responding. Which, when you compare that to the supply of new units in any given year, it's pretty substantial. We also asked respondents how they would feel about other potential housing options. About 9% said they would consider moving to a purpose-built retirement complex or village. The three other options we provided the responses were statistically very similar. Not much interest in living in an apartment in the same area, or adapting the home and leasing part of that adapted home, or equity release to help fund future needs such as health expenses. These elicit a very positive response. We ran some regressions on the response to the question that if you could sell your home and purchase a smaller purpose-built home for mature households in the same area for a lower price, would you do so? So 17.6% of respondents responded favorably to that. And so running the regressions, what was interesting were the type of variables which strongly came out as encouraging a decision to downsize under those circumstances. So the older a household became, the less likely they were to be willing to move. And also the longer the household was in place in the home, the less likely they were to downsize under those circumstances. It also seemed to be the case that living in Dublin or indeed in Leinster and having 2+ unused bedrooms would positively incline a household to consider downsizing under those circumstances. But it's important to note that really, in terms of the statistical significance of the results, it's age and duration in the home that were strongly influential. What interested us as well was the characteristics which did not predict a willingness to move. So gender, household composition, whether it's a single person or a couple with children, the source of income, such as whether the household would be dependent on a pension, a state pension, or other income, proximity to children, the home value, and urban and rural location. None of those variables seemed to have any influence on willingness to move. We asked respondents about intergenerational gifting. To what extent had they offered their children financial support to help buy a home? So some variation here, depending on the number of children respondents had. So a first child was somewhere about 20% likely to have been offered financial support to help buy a home, whilst a fifth child, statistically significant, a result of about 10%. Our interpretation of that is not so much that first childs are favoured. It's probably more the case that large households, those with 5 children, for instance, just are unable to generate the liquid assets over the life cycle to be gifted. The most common gift to children was under 10,000, but there was a lot of variation. Somewhere about between 4.6% and 16.7% of gifts to first children were over 100,000 euros. So, and our conclusions are that as matters stand, there's relatively low interest in downsizing. Somewhere between 3 and 6% will be likely to move in the future as matters stand. However, that could be shifted up to between 15 and 20%, which is equivalent to somewhere between 90 and 120,000 households, would be willing to move if they could sell their home and purchase a smaller purpose-built home in the same area for a lower price. The factors that seem to be inhibiting mobility are, for many households, non-economic. So most feasible policy measures seem unlikely to considerably alter preferences for the majority of households. But there is an opportunity there, as this is a large population and subgroups within that population, as I said, the younger part of this cohort and those households which have spent less time in the house they're currently in, they are considerably more receptive to the possibility of downsizing. And in terms of the type of measures which might be most impactful if the state sought to encourage greater downsizing would be to, as I said, provide greater availability of suitable units locally, perhaps also to simplify the process and have the state act as an honest broker and or financial incentive. Okay, well, that's the end of the presentation. And thank you very much.
So thank you, Owen, for that really interesting presentation. One thing I think that the data shows is that providing different housing options for people as they age would be of interest to a sizable segment of the Irish population. And I think it links really well to what my colleague Rory Mulholland and I are now going to talk about. This is research that we carried out to see if it would make financial sense to the state to invest in supported housing for older people. And we're going to show you that it would. This paper is actually the third in a series of thinking ahead reports carried out by the Housing Agency in the area of housing for older people. In 2016, the Housing Agency published its first thinking ahead report with ISACs. And one of the findings in this was that there was a need for, but a lack of, housing specifically built for older people, or what we're going to call for the rest of this presentation, supported housing. In 2018, the Housing Agency produced more research in this area when we provided case studies of 19 really good examples of supported housing in Ireland. This paper is the natural next step in the work that we have been doing. So I'm just going to share my screen now with you. So we set ourselves the task of finding out whether it would make sense financially to the state to build or invest in more supported housing options for older people. We set out to understand and measure the capital costs and the running costs of supported housing in both the social and the private sectors. And one of the reasons we did this was to be able to provide the implementation group with evidence to help support some of the actions in the policy statement around measures to support right sizing. And crucially, what is at the heart of this policy which is about supporting and enabling people to have access to different housing options. What we did first was define what we meant by supported housing. And I think once we had that answered, we then had to ask what it costs to build and run this type of housing. Anecdotally, we knew that living in supported housing had a positive impact on people's health, but we also wanted to provide costings on what this impact looked like. And finally, in order to work out if investing in this housing made sense, we asked what are the financial costs or benefits to the state if it did nothing. And so we costed out the counterfactual, where people would be living in the absence of supported housing. We realised that supported housing has different meanings, and I think this is something that potentially down the line greater clarity and definitions may need to be provided. Throughout the paper, when we refer to supported housing, we mean housing that falls broadly into the categories of 4, 5, and 6 in this diagram: independent, assisted living, and specialised living. These have different levels of services associated with them and different running costs and capital costs. I think that the next 3 slides will make it a bit easier to understand what we mean. So here you can see pictures of Ballygall, which is run by Fold, Collivat Court and Broom Lodge run by Clwyd Housing. In all of these, people have their own front doors, their own external private spaces. People live independently with as much or as little interaction with others as they want. The housing is secure with personal alarms or an emergency response system in place, and there normally wouldn't be any health or medical supports, but a caretaker or housing officer may be on site and often acts as a liaison with the public health nurse and other services. There may be communal rooms or cafes also as part of the scheme. The next level of supported housing, assisted living, offers similar secure own-door homes as independent living with social and community interaction. However, this housing is often co-located with a HSE daycare or primary care centre. These often offer outreach services to the residents and the wider community, and the HSE is involved in allocating residents to the housing. In the model in the paper, we've used Unclúnaín Kilmally in County Clare and taken into consideration some of the costs of the daycare centre that is co-located on the same site and many of the residents use. Finally, the supported housing, which enables those with greater care needs to live as independently as possible, we refer to in the paper as specialised living. Here you see pictures of Anam Cara on the top, which provides homes for 56 frail older people in Dublin and people living with dementia, and the Carebright community in Limerick, providing homes for people living with dementia. People in this housing can live with as much independence as they're able for, and it is an alternative for some to a nursing home. Anam Cara is used to provide the costings information for the model in this paper, though we also use the learnings that we took from the new Dublin City Council housing model that's being developed in Inchicore. So I'm now going to hand you over to Rory Mulholland, who's going to take you through what was done and the results.
Thanks, Rosalind. So in doing this research, as Rosalind stated above, we had 4 key areas which we wanted to look at. We asked, where would older people live in the absence of supported housing? We looked at the capital and running costs of supported housing and its alternative. We looked at the financial impact of the health and social care benefits associated with supported housing, and also what those benefits could look like across a wider population. This was informed by data from a number of sources, which you can see pictured here, including the HSE, CSO, Department of Housing, Tilda, Fold Ireland, as well as the Irish Council for Social Housing. So just moving forward, one of the key comparisons and drivers of savings in our model is the difference in capital costs. We would expect the capital costs for supported housing to be lower than the typical housing unit due to their smaller size. To arrive at an estimate of the capital costs of supported housing, we looked at the delivery costs reported in the Housing Options for Our Ageing Population policy statement, which presented the capital costs of 12 supported housing schemes. Using a more recent model within that report gave us a representative cost of 189,000 for a unit of supported housing. In the case of specialised housing, we increased the costs to 220,000. This was informed by discussions with stakeholders. Looking at the cost of nursing home care, the capital costs for a nursing home bed were evidenced from a cost-benefit analysis done for the Department of Health in 2015 and are entered into the model here at €167,589. We use a 2018 average cost of a new build social house as the representative cost for a social housing unit. This is €233,382 within the model. For private housing, which has a low cost within the model, and due to its basically low cost to the state from direct support, we assume a cost of €8,000 for a housing adaptation grant. And this is the maximum grant in this case. Moving on to look at running costs, we looked at the running costs for each of the tenures, and this is really a driver of a lot of difference in costs over time within the model. I must add that this is from the point of view of the exchequer in terms of the costs that it provides and supports. So we took rental assistance as the annual running cost in the case of independent living. This is approximately €2,000 per annum within the model. For assisted living, we used the running costs of Unclúnaín in Kilmally and made assumptions about the cost of daycare for external users of that facility to estimate an annual running cost per unit of €5,200 per annum. The most expensive form of supported housing and the one which provides the highest level of care is specialised living, This costs €33,000 per annum within our model. This was evidenced from running costs of Anam Cara. We would still expect higher running costs for delivery of nursing home care, which has a cost within the model of €45,883. This reflects an average of both public and private nursing home care. Running costs for social housing were based on a payment and availability agreement, which is in turn based on the capital costs of the average new build social house. We assume no running costs in the case of private housing. Another key driver of financial benefits for supported housing are, of course, the health and social care benefits. We see reduced requirements across a range of areas here, which really drive savings. GP visits have been shown to be reduced by 46% through supported housing when compared to the counterfactual. Hospital admissions are also one of the large drivers of savings. The saving here is arrived at through a reduction in the reduced probability of admission and reduced length of stay, which really drives down costs. Within the model, we estimate a cost saving of €1,296 per unit of supported housing in each year. Similarly, there are savings in outpatient attendance with a 20% reduction expected. One area we feel that the model has been very conservative in estimating the financial benefits of is in the area of home help and daycare. We estimate a small saving of €106 and €96 per annum based on the data on uptake that we used and limited data on costs. The savings may in fact be larger. In total, we estimate that the whole health and social care savings per annum from a supported housing unit being in place of a regular housing unit is €1,877 in each year. So then we asked, where would older people be living in the absence of supported housing? And in order to combine all the financials above into a single model, we needed to make some assumptions about where older people would live in the absence of supported housing. We broadly split this into a social housing model and a private market model, the difference being the use of social housing or private housing in the alternative. In the case of independent living, where care needs are lower, we estimate that the majority of the population would live in their own home, be that social or private, with a very small proportion would be placed in nursing home care, and this is 5% within the model, specifically for independent living. This is contrasted with the case of specialised living, where we assume 100% of those who would be in specialised living would be in nursing home care in the absence of specialised living. This reflects the higher level of care required in that setting. In the middle, we have assisted living, where we assume 15% would require nursing home care, and 85% would then be in either social housing or private housing. Moving on then, so to look specifically at the case of independent living, when we add up all the capital costs, the running costs, and the health and social care benefits of independent living, we arrive at the net cost of independent living. We then compare this to the cost of the counterfactual. Here we see the net cost of independent living is $11,800. This compares to $16,500 cost per annum of the counterfactual. This drives a benefit of €4,700 to the state in each year. Summing over a 30-year period, we get a total benefit of €106,000. And this is after discounting and also accounting for shadow price of public funds. Moving on to look at assisted living. The costs of assisted living here also taking into account the capital costs, the running costs, and the health benefits. And we arrive at a total net cost of $14,500 per annum. This reflects a higher level of care in assisted living in comparison to independent living. The cost of the counterfactual is similarly higher here, reflecting increased need for nursing home care. The cost counterfactual in the case of the assisted living model is $19,700, which drives an annual benefit of €5,200 per annum to the state. This produces a total financial benefit of over 30 years of $117,000 from each unit of assisted living. I've passed over the detail on the case of private model in both these cases, and we'll come back to it later. In the case of specialised living, again, we see an increased cost here. We estimate a total net cost of supported housing of €45,700. This reflects, again, the high level of care which is required in specialised living. But again, this is contrasted against counterfactual, where there is also a high level of care required through the provision of nursing home care, The cost here is 47,900. So we see an annual saving of €2,200 per annum in favour of the state. Over 30 years, this drives a benefit of €48,900 from each unit of specialised living provided. So just to summarise some findings, we find a very strong net benefit to the state from investment in supported housing. This is primarily driven from savings on expensive nursing home beds, as well as delivering smaller units of housing and the associated health and social care benefits. When we take this to a wider population, the savings add up quite dramatically. We estimate that replacing 11,400 units of regular housing and nursing home beds with a mix of supported housing units would produce a financial benefit of almost $1 billion to the state. We can see the table here, which shows the total benefits of each type of supported housing. However, the comparisons are stronger in the case of social provision. The significant savings available from private provision make no assumptions about the viability or funding model for that provision, which is an important caveat to bear in mind when considering the financial benefits. I'll now hand you back over to Rosalind.
Thank you, Rory. So for all of the housing types, and for both the social and private, the evidence Rory has shown you in the last slide points to significant savings to the state if it was to invest in more supported housing. We've costed out private and social models, and the savings are found mainly through the reduction or replacement of the need for people to live in nursing homes. I think it's important, however, to stress that these benefits are purely financial, and the wider benefits to society of people living independently within their own homes, with their own front doors, yet within a community, have not been costed. But in light of all that is currently happening, I think it makes an even stronger case for this type of housing than all the financial modelling we've shown here. There are issues that we pose in the paper to consider. I suppose firstly, the current financial investment model is based on a substantial proportion of the population owning their own home. But I suppose increasingly we know more people remain living all their lives within the rental sector, and this will have cost implications with the current model. Another issue, or perhaps consideration, is that in this paper we've divided supported housing into 3 different types. But if we look at the Dublin City Council Age-Friendly Pathfinder project in Inchicore, this is going to combine all 3 models in one. In the analysis, we've also separated social and private. However, currently it isn't as simple, and there potentially may be more mixed models where social and private residents live together in the same scheme considered within new funding models. And finally, within the context of private schemes, we believe more work would need to be done to understand the viability of the private sector model if this is to develop. So thank you very much for listening. All of what we've said today can be found in the paper up on the Housing Agency's website. So I'm now going to hand over to Eddie Lewis, who's going to respond to both Owen's paper on the attitudes of mature homeowners and our own paper. Many of you will know Eddie as he's spent more than 30 years working in the Department of Housing and has worked on many key housing policy reforms over that time. He now runs the Professional Diploma in Housing Studies at the IPA. Thank you very much, Eddie.
Okay, good afternoon.
Thank you, Rosalind, and also for the invitation to speak at the launch of these 2 important studies. I was wondering if the invitation had anything to do with the closeness of my age to the median respondent to the survey. I hope this does not raise expectations of some special insights on the matter. I note and appreciate Owen's description of those of a certain age as mature. Of course, this does not make them knowledgeable or wise. As I think is clear from the presentations, the authors approach the subject from very different angles, but this works well and the studies are actually quite complementary. They come together in focusing on the alternative housing options available for older persons who may want or need to make the choice to move home. In a world in which governments are increasingly challenged to find the right balance between market incentives, regulatory controls, and persuasion, the paper by Owen and his colleagues has particular resonance. In the terminology of the behavioral economists, the government needs to be able to influence the choice architecture, if it is to promote the public interest. And we have seen with the efforts to address public responses to the pandemic, it is not always easy to get the message right. The survey carried out into older homeowners' attitudes towards downsizing and related questions is an important input into shaping the debate about how the government should approach this issue. Of course, it's not just about the message. You have to have real choices to offer people. And the second paper outlines in some considerable detail the economics underpinning public investment in different types of supported housing for older persons. Before responding to the reports directly, I should just like to remind anyone listening, echoing a point that was made earlier, that the papers being launched today are part of a larger research effort into the housing for older persons, an effort that underpinned the policy statement in housing options for an aging population. The studies need to be read as part of this major and growing area of study. And I should also add that I've had the benefit of reading these papers in advance, and there's a lot in them. In the time available, I can only touch on a couple of aspects of this, but there are other strands of thought well worth pursuing. In the first study, we are dealing with two cohorts, if you like, of the population. The first, a large and growing number of perhaps up to 600,000 homeowners of a mature age. It is clear from the report that there is considerable spare or underused housing capacity within this group. And we know Ireland tends to have somewhat larger housing units than most other countries. How can we make better use of this, especially in respect of older persons, where their direct space requirements are more likely to be reducing rather than increasing? The responses to the survey point to a number of barriers that need to be overcome. The attachment to house, and perhaps to a lesser degree than previous general surveys might have indicated, to the community that people are living in. Barriers also involve or come from the sheer effort involved in making a house move and how this can deter people. Finally, attitudes around inheritance, equity release, and helping adult children financially can add to the complexity surrounding the decision to move. And complexity in this case is likely to lead to delay and inaction. Of course, in these uncertain times, we may also have to allow for adult children returning to the family home. But I do recall the results of another survey. I think it was carried out in the UK, but it has universal application. The survey which confirmed that children are a source of happiness for their parents, but with the additional rider that the happiness quotient increased when they left home. The second cohort, which is perhaps of more direct concern to the two presentations today, is a smaller number of persons that are already positively inclined to downsizing, but perhaps need better choices, financial incentives, or some other type of assistance to make the move. Achieving a better utilization of the housing stock is certainly a worthy goal of public policy. Additional economic and social benefits for the individual concerned will also accrue if more older persons are enabled to live independently and in the community. Depending on the weighting you give to the responses to the survey, the numbers involved could go up or down. But even as a small percentage of overall numbers, the report talks about somewhere between 19,000 to 35,000 households interested in moving. It's still a sizable figure. If more suitable accommodation was available locally, then this number could increase substantially, perhaps to over 100,000. Now, even if only some of these actually make the move, it will still require a major building program of alternative suitable housing for this to have any effect. Is it an effort worth making? The case is certainly well made in Rosalind and Rory's report, that there are very considerable savings to the state in just about every scenario involving older persons living and being supported in the community rather than going into a care home setting. I doubt there would be any argument either that there are many other less quantifiable advantages. If I recall from earlier studies, it is also the stated wish of over 3/4 of older persons to stay living in their own home. To achieve this, we need a combination of the right solutions, suitable accommodation and appropriate support packages around downsizing, and also a clear message that resonates with the target audience and moves them to either act on their desire to downsize or at least encourages them to think about it. But we have to recognize the challenges. The movement to smaller homes may not bring about any economic gain to the households concerned. The cost of new build is such that if the values that people put on their homes in the survey are anything to go by, then it's not going to generate a financial surplus in many cases. Indeed, the cost of moving to a new, purpose-built, smaller unit may not be affordable by households that would otherwise be open to moving. This suggests to me that there will need to be a strong element of state investment, either directly into social housing or into suitably designed support packages. Hopefully, this will include a re-examination of the Fair Deal scheme, which has littered the country with vacant properties. And this brings me to my second point, the importance of achieving a better understanding of tenure pathways. The familiar outline of the movement to and sometimes through the different support levels, which Rosalind and Rory set out very clearly in their paper, represents something of an ideal. The reality, I suspect, is that the key behavioral pattern is to hold on in the family home as long as possible, until for medical reasons it is no longer comfortable or even safe to do so. Perhaps the one area of questioning that I would have liked to see expanded relates to the suitability of a household's existing accommodation for long-term living. Housing might be unsuitable for a variety of reasons, because it's too isolated. There might be mobility issues moving around within the house, that it's difficult to heat. It might have poor facilities. These are all concerns that came up in earlier surveys. It would be interesting to get a better sense of the current attitude of households around the long-term suitability and adaptability of their existing accommodation. The very fact of asking the question may help raise awareness of the need for older persons living in the family home to think about making future plans. We spend a lot of time promoting the importance of taking out a pension at a young age. We need to expend a similar amount of effort advising older persons of the importance of planning for different supported housing outcomes. I suspect that many who may have indicated at this point that they have no intention of downsizing would acknowledge that this may be forced upon them at some time in the future. It might be useful to know more about what might trigger such an eventuality. Finally, in deciding on investment priorities, we must not ignore the housing conditions which the majority of homeowners who are not contemplating a move currently live under. While the survey shows that the vast majority are content with the quality of their accommodation, it is less clear how suitable it will be as the occupants get older. The issue in this case may be, how can we extend the time that they can stay living in the house safely and comfortably rather than moving to another property, albeit one perhaps more obviously suited to their needs. As Owen's survey shows, there are strong personal attachments to the houses we live in. There's been a lot of progress made over the past few years in developing and implementing a strategy for the housing of older persons. These latest studies very much fit into this program of work. They make, as far as I can see, an unanswerable case for investing in supported housing on macroeconomic and individual welfare grounds. They focus on the individual households and what is likely to influence them in making the relevant choices about moving from the family home. As always, it is ultimately up to the government to ensure that the message is properly crafted and the necessary investments made. As I said at the beginning, there is a lot of detail in both studies that bear further scrutiny. Far more ideas will come from them than I have been able to touch on in this short response. So please spend the effort and read them. Thank you very much for listening.
Eddie, thank you. Thank you very much. I think you really were able to kind of take those two papers and break them down and kind of hone in on the really interesting points that are in there. I suppose with all of it, it goes without saying when we go back and look at the policy that it is about options and enabling people to have those options. And as you say, majority of people are living in their own homes, in their own communities, and that's where they're going to stay. But it is, I suppose, about the choice that we've been focusing here today on. I also think, you know, you mentioned the financial viability, and I would say yes, that is something. It's not straightforward, and I think there will be, as you say, more work will come out of the research that we've done. I just want to open up now to the Minister, just to give him the opportunity if there is anything, Minister Burke, that you'd like to say before we start to draw things to a close.
The Minister had to disconnect just a few moments ago, Rosalind. So.
Okay, well, that's fine. So what I'd like to say, I suppose now is, you know, many of you have questions. Some were coming in there and we were answering them. Both of the papers are up on the Housing Agency's website. And I think a lot of what you were asking will, great. A lot of what, some of the questions that you will have, you'll be able to find out there. And if not on the papers, their contact details, my contact details, Owen's contact details are there, and Rory's, if you'd like to kind of come back to us with questions. So now on behalf of John O'Connor and my colleagues here in the Housing Agency, I would like to firstly thank the Minister for launching the papers and for what he said. I'd like everyone to thank everybody who's helped make today work, especially Gemma on the difficult technical side, the communications team here in the agency, and obviously Owen, Rory and Eddie, as well as the Minister, for their words. And I'd like to thank everybody for